Over 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during the Second World War. Over 400,000 of them never came home. On the home front, the country transformed. People moved. Women went to work in factories. Everyone rationed everything from gasoline to sugar. The experience was total. It touched every single life in the country, from the soldier on a distant island to the child collecting scrap metal in a small town. When it was over, the world was different, and the people who lived through it were different too. They became what Tom Brokaw would later call the greatest generation. But what does that mean? What forged them? Was it just the fighting, or was it something deeper, a collection of experiences that fundamentally rewired how they saw the world, their country, and themselves? How did a generation defined by the scarcity of the Great Depression and the sacrifice of a global conflict go on to build the most prosperous nation in history? Number 16, how does a generation process grief on an industrial scale? They didn't talk about it. That's the simple answer, but it's not the whole story. The Second World War produced casualties on a scale that is hard to comprehend. The United States lost over 407,000 military personnel. Every community had a Gold Star mother, a woman who had lost a son. Every neighborhood knew a family with an empty chair at the dinner table. This was not isolated tragedy. It was a national, shared experience of loss, and yet the generation that endured it was known for its stoicism, its quiet resolve. They didn't have grief counselors or support groups in the modern sense. They had work, they had family, they had the future. The process of grieving was formal and private. When a Western Union telegram arrived, it was a moment of quiet, personal devastation. The historian Drew Gilpin Faust, in her book, This Republic of Suffering, wrote about the Civil War's impact on American attitudes toward death. The Second World War did something similar, but with a modern, bureaucratic feel. The notifications were standardized. The burials were often far away, in military cemeteries overseas. Families received a folded flag, a final letter, perhaps a few personal effects. There was no body to view, no local funeral in many cases. The loss was abstract, a name on a memorial wall. This distance shaped the grieving process. It became an internal affair. You carried your grief, you didn't display it. The culture of the time reinforced this. The goal was to move forward, to build a better world for which the sacrifice had been made. Dwelling on loss was seen as counterproductive. It was a private burden. The stoicism was not a lack of feeling. It was a coping mechanism. In Studs Terkel's oral history, The Good War, you can hear it in the voices of the people he interviewed. They speak of lost friends and brothers with a kind of matter-of-fact sadness, a pain that has been folded up and put away, but not thrown out. It was a generation that learned to live alongside its ghosts. They honored the dead by living well, by building the prosperous post-war world. The baby boom itself can be seen as an affirmation of life in the face of so much death, but this came at a cost. The unprocessed grief, the buried trauma, manifested in other ways. It can be seen in the quiet alcoholism of some veterans, the emotional distance in some families, the never-complain attitude that could sometimes morph into an inability to communicate pain. They had seen what they considered real suffering, and their own problems seemed small in comparison. This perspective could be a source of strength, but also a barrier to emotional intimacy. They had a shared secret, a collective memory of loss that bonded them together, but also isolated them from future generations who hadn't lived it. They didn't need to explain their sadness to each other. They all knew. What are the long-term psychological effects of a nation collectively suppressing its grief? If a generation carries its sorrow in silence, does that silence get passed down to its children in other forms? How did the mass experience of distant, impersonal death in the war change our fundamental relationship with mortality itself? Number 15, did the war tear up America's roots and replant them? Before the war, America was a more static country. Many people lived and died in the same town, sometimes in the same house, where they were born. The war changed that completely. It was one of the largest internal migrations in American history. People moved for two main reasons: military service and war work. Over 16 million people, mostly young men, were uprooted from their homes and sent to training camps across the country, then shipped overseas. A farm boy from Iowa might find himself training in California, seeing the ocean for the first time before being sent to the Pacific. A kid from a New York City borough might end up in a camp in the deep South, experiencing a totally different culture. This alone was a massive sociological event. It mixed people from different regions, classes, and backgrounds in a way that had never happened before. At the same time, the home front was in motion. The historian James N. Gregory documented this in his book, The Southern Diaspora. Millions of Americans, both black and white, left the rural South to seek jobs in the industrial centers of the North, Midwest, and especially the West Coast. Cities like Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon, saw their populations explode. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, for example, became a magnet for workers from all over the country. This wasn't just a move for a job, it was a move to a new life. People left behind family farms, small towns, and generations of history. They moved into hastily constructed housing projects, lived among strangers, and adapted to the relentless pace of wartime production. This mass movement had profound consequences. It broke down regional barriers. Accents mingled. People from different parts of the country married each other. It created a more national, less regional identity. The war effort itself, a single national goal, reinforced this. It also created new social tensions as different groups were suddenly living side by side, but the biggest impact was on the generation itself. They became more mobile, less tied to a single place. After the war, many of them didn't go back home. The GI who trained in California and saw a world of opportunity and good weather might decide to stay there. The factory worker who left a poor farm in Oklahoma might not want to return to that life. This created the post-war boom in the West and the Sun Belt. It was a generation that had seen the wider world, and they were no longer content with the confines of their hometowns. This mobility became a key feature of the post-war American dream, the ability to pack up and move for a better opportunity. This experience gave them a broader perspective, but it also came with a sense of rootlessness. The tight-knit, multi-generational communities of the past began to fray. The new suburbs they would later build were filled with people from somewhere else. This created a different kind of community, one based on shared experience and aspiration rather than shared history. The war taught them that home was not necessarily a place you were from, but a place you could make. How much of America's post-war economic dynamism was fueled simply by this massive forced redistribution of its population? Did this era of mass migration permanently weaken the American sense of local community? What did we lose when we gained the freedom to move anywhere? Number 14, how did the war turn soldiers into scholars? Before the war, a college education was largely a privilege of the wealthy. In 1940, only about 5% of American adults had a college degree. The war completely democratized higher education in America. The instrument of this change was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill of Rights. It was one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history. The bill was conceived out of a fear of what would happen when 16 million service members returned home. The lawmakers worried about mass unemployment and social unrest, remembering the troubles that followed the First World War. They wanted to ease the transition. The GI Bill provided a range of benefits, including low-interest mortgages and business loans, but its most revolutionary feature was the educational subsidy. It offered to pay for college or vocational training for returning veterans. The results were stunning. Millions of former soldiers, sailors, and Marines, men who would have otherwise gone straight into a factory or onto a farm, flooded into America's colleges and universities. By 1947, veterans made up nearly half of all college students in the country. This wasn't just a change in numbers, it was a change in culture. The campuses, once dominated by the young and affluent, were now filled with older, more mature students. These were men who had seen the world, who had faced life and death situations. They were serious, focused, and eager to learn. The historian Edward Humes, in his book Over Here, describes how these veterans changed the very nature of university life. They raised academic standards and brought a level of real-world experience that enriched the classroom. This influx of students forced colleges to expand dramatically, building new classrooms, dormitories, and entire campuses. The modern American university system, with its large public institutions, is a direct product of the GI Bill. The impact on the economy was immense. The country was investing in human capital on an unprecedented scale. This educated workforce fueled the post-war economic boom. It created a generation of engineers, doctors, lawyers, scientists, and teachers who drove innovation and prosperity for decades. It also created a new middle class, one for whom a college degree and the economic security it brought was an attainable goal. The GI Bill was not without its flaws. Its benefits were not always distributed equally, with African American veterans often facing discrimination that prevented them from taking full advantage of the educational opportunities. But for millions, it was a ticket to a life they could have never imagined before the war. It cemented the idea that an education was not just for the elite, but was a key part of the American dream. It was a reward for service, a tool for social mobility, and an investment in the nation's future. The war, which had interrupted their lives, ended up giving them an opportunity that would define the rest of those lives. Was the GI Bill's success a happy accident born of fear of unemployment, or was it a moment of genuine visionary public investment? If the government had not stepped in, would the class-based structure of higher education have ever been broken? What does it say about our society that we enacted our greatest educational investment only as a way to manage the aftermath of a war? Number 13, did the factory floor become the new battlefield? The war was won not just on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, but on the assembly lines of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles. The conflict was a war of production. The sheer industrial might of the United States was one of its most powerful weapons. And the generation that came of age during this time internalized a new and powerful work ethic. They weren't just building planes and ships. They were, in their minds, directly contributing to the war effort. The factory floor became a front line in its own right. Before the war, the Great Depression had left millions unemployed, and work was scarce and precious. The war changed that overnight. Suddenly, there were more jobs than people to fill them. The federal government, through organizations like the War Production Board, coordinated the complete retooling of American industry. Automobile plants stopped making cars and started making tanks and bombers. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, a mile-long factory, was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber almost every hour at its peak. This was production on a scale the world had never seen. This environment forged a specific kind of work ethic. It was about speed, efficiency, and collective effort. Propaganda posters with slogans like, "The man who relaxes is helping the Axis," were everywhere. Workers were constantly reminded that their labor had a direct impact on the lives of soldiers overseas. A poorly welded seam on a ship could cost lives. A delay in production could mean a shortage of supplies at the front. This created an immense sense of purpose and responsibility. People worked long hours, often 6 or 7 days a week. They took pride in their work because it was part of a larger noble cause. This experience had a lasting impact. The generation that worked in these war plants developed a deep respect for hard, tangible work. They saw firsthand what a unified, focused nation could achieve. This belief in the power of collective industrial effort carried over into the post-war years. It fueled the construction of the interstate highway system, the growth of suburbs, and the manufacturing boom of the 1950s and 60s. The idea that you went to work, did your job well, and contributed to something bigger than yourself became a core tenet of their worldview. It was a pragmatic, no-nonsense approach to work. You showed up on time, you did what was asked, and you didn't complain. This work ethic was also shaped by the memory of the Depression. Having a steady job with a good wage was something they never took for granted. They valued security and stability. This is one reason why union membership grew and why they tended to be loyal employees, often staying with the same company for their entire career. The war had shown them the power of a coordinated industrial economy, and they were the ones who built it and ran it for the next 3 decades. When work is tied to a national survival mission, does it create a work ethic that can ever be replicated in peacetime? Did this generation's focus on collective industrial achievement come at the cost of individual creativity and entrepreneurship? How much of their legendary work ethic was about patriotism and how much was simply about the relief of having a steady paycheck after a decade of depression. Or number 12, why did they believe so strongly in their leaders and systems? The generation that fought the Second World War had a deep and abiding trust in American institutions. They trusted the government, the military, the media, and large corporations in a way that seems almost unimaginable today. This trust was not naive, it was earned in the crucible of the war. They had seen these institutions mobilize to defeat a global threat. They had seen the government orchestrate a massive industrial effort. They had seen the military lead them to victory. The system, as they saw it, had worked. This trust began at the top. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats had created a sense of direct personal connection with the nation's leader. During the war, people looked to the government for direction, and the government delivered. It managed rationing, organized bond drives, and provided a steady stream of information, albeit heavily censored, about the war's progress. Figures like General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General George Marshall were seen as competent, steady leaders. They were not political figures in the modern sense. They were managers of a vast, complex, and successful enterprise. The success of massive government projects, from the Manhattan Project to the logistics of the D-Day invasion, created a profound sense of confidence in the government's ability to get big things done. The media played a crucial role in building this trust. Journalists like Ernie Pyle reported from the front lines, sharing the stories of ordinary soldiers. His columns gave a human face to the war and were trusted implicitly by the public. The news, both in print and on the radio, presented a unified, patriotic message. The Office of War Information carefully managed the flow of information to maintain morale and support for the war effort. While we would view this as propaganda today, at the time it was seen as a necessary part of a collective struggle. The media and the government were on the same team. This trust extended to the corporate world. Large companies were seen as partners in the war effort, the arsenal of democracy. The post-war economic boom, which these same companies led, seemed to validate this trust. They provided stable, lifelong employment and pensions. There was a sense of a social contract. A person would work hard for a company, and the company would take care of them. This broad-based trust in institutions created a society with a high degree of social cohesion. People believed they were all in it together, and that the leaders and systems in place were generally working in their best interests. This consensus was the bedrock upon which the stable and prosperous society of the 1950s was built. But this trust had a flip side. It could lead to a lack of skepticism, a willingness to accept official narratives without question. The consensus of the post-war era often papered over deep-seated problems, particularly in the area of civil rights. The same generation that trusted its government to win a war would later be slow to question its government during the social upheavals of the 1960s. Their faith was in the system that had saved the world. Questioning that system felt like a betrayal of the sacrifices that had been made. How much of this generational trust was a direct result of wartime censorship and propaganda? Did their faith in large, centralized institutions make them less able to adapt to the more decentralized and complex world that followed? When an entire generation places its faith in the system, what happens to the voices of dissent and criticism that are necessary for a healthy democracy? Number 11 was personal sacrifice, just an expectation, not a choice. For the generation that came of age during the Second World War, sacrifice was not an abstract concept. It was a daily reality. It was woven into the fabric of life, both for the soldiers on the front lines and for their families back home. And it was not seen as something extraordinary. It was simply what was required. It was a duty. This sense of collective sacrifice and duty is one of the most defining characteristics of this generation. The most obvious sacrifice was military service. When the nation called, millions of young men answered. The draft was a part of life. There was a shared understanding that personal plans, careers, education, marriage had to be put on hold. The needs of the country came first. This was not a matter of political debate for most people. It was a self-evident truth. The slogan, "We're all in this together," was not just propaganda, it was a lived experience. This shared sense of purpose created a powerful bond. Everyone was making sacrifices, so no one felt they were carrying the burden alone. On the home front, sacrifice took different forms. Rationing was perhaps the most widespread example. The government's Office of Price Administration instituted a complex system of ration books and points for everything from gasoline and tires to coffee, sugar, and meat. This was not just an inconvenience. It fundamentally changed how people shopped, cooked, and lived. People planted victory gardens to supplement their food supply. By 1943, these gardens were producing an estimated 40% of the fresh vegetables grown in the country. People collected scrap metal, rubber, and cooking grease for the war effort. Children bought war-saving stamps at school. These were small acts, but they added up to a massive collective effort. More than just material goods, people sacrificed their time and labor. Millions of women entered the workforce, many for the first time, taking on demanding jobs in heavy industry. Volunteers ran bond drives, worked for the Red Cross, and served as air raid wardens. The entire country was mobilized. This culture of sacrifice was reinforced everywhere. Movies, songs, and advertisements all carried the message that personal comfort and desire were secondary to the war effort. This had a profound psychological effect. It taught a generation that their individual needs were not the most important thing in the world. They learned to be patient, to make do, and to find satisfaction in contributing to a cause larger than themselves. This attitude carried over into their post-war lives. It shaped their approach to family, community, and citizenship. They were often uncomfortable with what they saw as the self-indulgence of later generations. They had been taught that the good of the group outweighed the desires of the individual. Was this sense of duty a natural response to a clear and present danger, or was it a product of a society that was more conformist and less individualistic? If an entire generation is taught to put the collective first, does that make it harder for them to recognize and defend individual rights? Can a society function without this shared sense of sacrifice, and have we lost something essential by no longer expecting it? Number 10, could you fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home? The Second World War was fought under the banner of freedom and democracy. Yet for millions of African Americans, these ideals were not a reality in their own country. This profound contradiction is central to understanding the war's impact on this generation. African Americans served in the military and worked in war industries, contributing significantly to the victory. But they did so in a society that was deeply segregated and unequal. This experience created a new urgency and a new momentum for the civil rights movement. The military itself was segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, often relegated to support roles rather than combat. The Tuskegee Airmen, a group of African-American fighter pilots, had to fight for the right to fly in combat missions. Despite facing discrimination within the institution they were serving, they performed with great distinction. Their story, and others like it, highlighted the absurdity of fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. This experience in the military, where they were judged on their performance and saw a world beyond the segregated South, was radicalizing for many black veterans. On the home front, the demand for labor in war industries opened up new opportunities for black workers. Millions migrated from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West, a movement known as the Second Great Migration. But they often faced hostility and discrimination in their new homes. There were race riots in several cities, including Detroit in 1943. Despite these challenges, earning a factory wage was a step up for many, providing a new degree of economic independence. This period gave rise to the Double V Fight campaign, a concept championed by the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the leading African-American newspapers. The two V's stood for victory over the enemy abroad and victory over racism at home. This slogan captured the dual struggle that black Americans were waging. They were patriots supporting the war effort, but they were also demanding that America live up to its own ideals. This was a new, more assertive phase in the fight for civil rights. The war provided a powerful moral argument. How could America be a credible leader of the free world if it denied basic freedoms to its own citizens? When the war ended, black veterans returned home with a new sense of empowerment and impatience. The GI Bill, while a great opportunity for many, was often administered in a discriminatory way, making it harder for black veterans to get home loans or access higher education. but the war had changed them. They had fought for their country, and they were no longer willing to accept the status quo of segregation and disenfranchisement. The war experience, the Double V campaign, and the new consciousness of black veterans laid the essential groundwork for the major civil rights battles of the 1950s and 1960s. The war, in this sense, was a catalyst that exposed the deep hypocrisy at the heart of American life and energized the movement that would eventually challenge it. How did white soldiers who fought alongside or were served by black units reconcile that experience with the segregation they had grown up with? Did the government's need for national unity during the war actively suppress a more direct confrontation with racial injustice? In what ways did the fight against a foreign ideology of racial hierarchy force America to begin a painful and still incomplete examination of its own? Number 9, why did they rush to the altar and the nursery? The end of the Second World War triggered two of the most significant demographic events of the 20th century, a marriage boom and a baby boom. The generation that had endured years of separation, uncertainty, and loss rushed into family life with a fervor that reshaped American society. This was not just a return to normal, it was a powerful collective statement about the future. The marriage boom started even before the war was over. Many young couples married hastily before a soldier was shipped overseas. It was a way to hold on to something solid in a world of chaos. After the war, the trend accelerated. The marriage rate in the United States reached an all-time high in 1946. People who had put their lives on hold were eager to start their families. There was a deep-seated yearning for the security and normalcy that family life represented. After years of living in barracks and factory dormitories, the idea of having one's own home and family was incredibly powerful. This desire for normalcy was quickly followed by the baby boom. From 1946 to 1964, an unprecedented number of babies were born in the United States. At its peak in 1957, a baby was born every 7 seconds. This was not just a matter of making up for lost time. Several factors contributed to this phenomenon. The post-war economy was booming, and for the first time in a generation, people felt economically secure enough to have large families. The GI Bill helped veterans buy homes in the new suburbs, which were designed as places to raise children. Culturally, there was an intense focus on the family. Magazines, television shows, and advertisements all promoted an idealized image of the nuclear family with a father who was the breadwinner and a mother who was a homemaker. The sociologist Glenn Elder, in his landmark study, Children of the Great Depression, found that this generation's experience of economic hardship followed by wartime separation gave them a profound appreciation for family as a source of stability and emotional satisfaction. They wanted to give their children the secure, prosperous childhoods they had never had. This desire fueled their work ethic and their focus on providing for their families. The family became the central project of their lives, the place where they could build the better world they had fought for. This intense focus on the nuclear family also had its downsides. It created rigid gender roles, with women often being pushed out of the workforce and back into the domestic sphere after their wartime contributions. The conformity of suburban life could be stifling for some, but for the majority of the generation that lived through the war, the creation of a family was an act of profound optimism. It was a vote of confidence in the future. It was a way to replace the loss and destruction of the war with the creation and nurturing of new life. Each new home, each new baby, was a small victory against the chaos they had endured. Was the baby boom a biological and social reaction to the threat of annihilation, a deep-seated human impulse to repopulate after a catastrophe? How much of the intense focus on the nuclear family was a genuine desire for stability, and how much was a societal pressure to conform to a single idealized model? Did creating a perfect family life for their children place an unspoken emotional burden on the baby boomers to live up to their parents' sacrifices? Number 8, did the war build the suburbs and the middle class? The image of post-war America is inextricably linked with the suburb, a neat house with a green lawn, a car in the driveway, and a family inside. This version of the American dream was, in large part, a direct consequence of the Second World War. The war created both the demand for this lifestyle and the means to achieve it. It was the catalyst for the creation of a vast property-owning middle class. The demand came from the 16 million veterans returning home. They needed places to live, and they were starting families at a record rate. The cities were crowded, and the existing housing stock was old. This created a massive housing shortage. The means to solve this crisis came from two sources: the federal government and a new model of industrial production. The government's role was crucial. The GI Bill offered low-interest, zero-down payment home loans to veterans. This made homeownership accessible to a huge number of people who would have otherwise been renters for life. The Federal Housing Administration also insured mortgages, which encouraged banks to lend money for new construction. The new model of production was pioneered by developers like William Levitt. Applying the mass production techniques he had seen used to build military barracks during the war, Levitt created Levittown, New York. His company broke down the construction process into dozens of simple, repetitive steps. Teams of workers would move from house to house, performing the same task over and over. This assembly line approach dramatically lowered the cost and increased the speed of construction. At its peak, Levitt's crews were finishing a new house every 16 minutes. These affordable single-family homes were exactly what the new generation of families was looking for. This combination of government-backed financing and mass-produced housing transformed the American landscape. Suburbs exploded around major cities. This new lifestyle was made possible by another product of the post-war boom, the automobile. A car was necessary for commuting to work from the new suburbs, and the booming auto industry was there to provide it. The government further fueled this trend with the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which created the interstate highway system. This massive public works project, justified in part for national defense purposes, solidified the car-centric culture of suburban America. For the generation that had grown up with the economic insecurity of the Depression and the upheaval of the war, owning a home was the ultimate symbol of security and success. It was a tangible piece of the prosperity they had fought to create. It represented stability, privacy, and a safe place to raise their children. This mass expansion of homeownership was the bedrock of the post-war middle class. However, this dream was not available to everyone. Restrictive covenants and discriminatory lending practices often excluded African American families from these new suburban communities, deepening racial segregation in the country. But for millions of white Americans, the war created a direct path from the battlefield to a suburban backyard. To what extent was the creation of the suburbs a deliberate social engineering project designed to promote a specific consumer-driven, family-centric lifestyle? Did the move to sprawling, car-dependent suburbs inadvertently destroy the walkable, community-oriented urban neighborhoods it replaced? How did the experience of living in standardized, uniform military barracks prepare a generation for the conformity of the mass-produced suburban tract house? Number 7. How did a nation of isolationists become the world's leader? Before the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the dominant political sentiment in the United States was isolationism. Many Americans, scarred by the experience of the First World War, were deeply reluctant to get involved in another foreign conflict. The war completely shattered this worldview. The experience of fighting a global war on two fronts and emerging from it as the world's sole economic and military superpower fundamentally changed America's relationship with the rest of the world. The generation that fought the war was the first to accept, and even embrace, America's new role as a global leader. The war was a massive logistical and strategic education for the entire country. The United States had to project its power across vast oceans, manage complex alliances, and plan for the post-war reconstruction of entire continents. This experience created a new generation of diplomats, military leaders, and policymakers who thought in global terms. Figures like George C. Marshall, who went from being the Army Chief of Staff during the war to Secretary of State afterward, embodied this shift. His plan for European recovery, the Marshall Plan, was a clear example of this new thinking. It was based on the understanding that American security and prosperity were directly linked to the stability and prosperity of the rest of the world. This was a radical departure from the pre-war isolationist mindset. The war also created a new set of international institutions largely designed and promoted by the United States. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 established the framework for the post-war global economy, creating the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 was another attempt to build a new international order that could prevent future conflicts. This was a generation that had seen the catastrophic failure of international diplomacy in the 1930s. They were determined not to repeat that mistake. They believed that American leadership was essential to maintaining peace and stability. This new internationalism was not just a policy of the elite. It was broadly supported by the American public. The veterans who had fought overseas had seen the devastation of the war firsthand. They understood in a very personal way what was at stake. They had a more worldly perspective than their parents' generation. They had seen different cultures, different countries, and the consequences of global conflict. This experience made them more willing to support an active role for America in the world. They had dismantled one global threat, and they felt a responsibility to prevent another from rising. This sense of global responsibility forged in the war would define American foreign policy for the next half-century. It was a heavy burden, and it would lead to its own set of complex and controversial conflicts, but it was a burden that this generation felt it had to bear. Was this shift to internationalism a genuine change of heart, or was it simply a pragmatic recognition that America's economic and security interests now span the globe? How did the experience of being celebrated as liberators in places like France and the Philippines shape the generation's self-perception and its view of America's role in the world? Did the immense power America held at the end of the war create a kind of national arrogance that would lead to future foreign policy mistakes? Number 6, what did they call the pain that had no name? The soldiers who returned from the Second World War came back with more than just medals and memories. Many of them carried invisible wounds. Today we have a name for it: post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But in the 1940s, the concept did not exist in the public consciousness. It was called shell shock or combat fatigue, terms that implied a temporary condition, a kind of exhaustion that could be cured with rest. The generation that fought the war had no language to describe the psychological trauma they had endured. So, for the most part, they didn't talk about it. The military's approach to psychological casualties was focused on getting soldiers back into the fight. The psychiatrist Thomas Salmon had developed principles during the First World War that emphasized treating soldiers close to the front lines with the expectation of a quick return to duty. This approach, while effective in some ways, reinforced the idea that psychological distress was a temporary problem to be overcome, not a deep and lasting injury. After the war, there was a collective desire to move on. The country was celebrating victory, and there was little room for the darker stories of what the war had done to the minds of its soldiers. The veterans themselves often felt a sense of shame or weakness about their psychological struggles. They were supposed to be heroes, the strong, silent types. Admitting to nightmares, flashbacks, or crippling anxiety didn't fit that image. So they buried it, they poured their energy into work, school, and family. The discipline and stoicism that had served them well in the war became their primary coping mechanisms in peace. This silence was often a heavy burden. In his book, What It Is Like to Go to War, the veteran and author Karl Marlantes writes about the deep moral and psychological injuries that war inflicts. The greatest generation carried these injuries in private. It manifested as alcoholism, depression, sudden bursts of anger, or an emotional distance that could be baffling to their families. Their children often grew up with fathers who were loving but also remote, haunted by something they could never explain. There were efforts to understand and treat these issues. The Veterans Administration expanded its psychiatric services after the war. Their researchers began to study the long-term effects of combat, but the cultural stigma remained powerful. The shared experience of the war did provide a unique form of therapy. Veterans could talk to each other in ways they couldn't talk to civilians. The local VFW or American Legion Hall became a place where they could share a common language of experience, even if they never spoke directly about their deepest traumas. But for many, the pain remained a private, unnamed struggle they carried for the rest of their lives. Their silence was not a sign of indifference, but a testament to the depth of a wound, for which their society had no cure and no name. How many of the social problems of the post-war era, from alcoholism to domestic strife, were the unacknowledged symptoms of mass, untreated trauma? Did this generation's inability to speak about their psychological pain create a pattern of emotional suppression that was passed on to their children? By labeling them the greatest generation, did we inadvertently make it even harder for them to admit to the vulnerabilities and injuries they carried? Number 5, did the war create a new contract between the government and its people? The relationship between the American people and their federal government was fundamentally altered by the Second World War. Before the war, and especially before the New Deal, many Americans had very little direct contact with the federal government. The war changed that. The government became a constant, powerful presence in the lives of every citizen. It drafted them, employed them, told them what they could buy, and managed the entire national economy. This vast expansion of government power and the successful outcome of the war created a new kind of social contract, an understanding that the government had a responsibility to provide security and opportunity for its citizens. During the war, the government's role was all-encompassing. The War Production Board dictated what factories would produce. The Office of Price Administration controlled prices and wages. The Draft Board decided who would serve in the military. This was a level of government intervention in the economy and in private lives that was unprecedented in American history. And by and large, people accepted it. They saw it as a necessary part of the collective effort to win the war. The success of this mobilization created a powerful lesson. A large, active federal government could be a force for good. It could achieve things that the private sector or individuals could not. This lesson was codified in the post-war era, most famously with the GI Bill. This was not a handout. It was seen as a debt owed by the nation to its veterans. The bill's full title was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. The key word is readjustment. There was a sense that the government had a responsibility to help those who had served to transition back into civilian life and to, have a fair shot at the prosperity they had secured. The GI Bill's investment in education and housing was a clear statement that the government's role included promoting social mobility and economic opportunity. This new contract was also evident in other areas. The Employment Act of 1946 formally committed the federal government to the goal of maintaining maximum employment. This would have been a radical idea a generation earlier. The post-war period saw a continuation of many New Deal-era social programs and a broad consensus, shared by both political parties, that the government had a role to play in smoothing out the rough edges of capitalism. This generation, having seen the government steer the country through the Depression and the war, had a pragmatic, non-ideological view of its role. If a government program worked, they supported it. They saw the government not as an enemy of freedom, but as a tool to be used to solve national problems and create a more stable and prosperous society. This trust and belief in the positive potential of government was a hallmark of their generation and a stark contrast to the political attitudes that would emerge later in the century. Was this new social contract an enduring change in American political philosophy, or was it a temporary consensus born of two unique crises, the Depression and the war? Did the success of the government in a time of total war create unrealistic expectations for what it could achieve in the more complex and contentious landscape of peacetime? How did this generation's comfort with a large, powerful government pave the way for both the Great Society programs of the 1960s and the later backlash against them? Number 4, how did a war of machines reshape their view of the future? The Second World War was the most technologically advanced conflict in history up to that point. It was a war of massive industrial production, of radar, of advanced aircraft, and ultimately of the atomic bomb. For the generation that fought and lived through it, this experience with technology had a profound and dual impact. It created both a sense of awe at the power of human ingenuity and a deep-seated anxiety about its destructive potential. On one hand, the war was a showcase for the power of science and technology to solve problems on a massive scale. The development of penicillin and other antibiotics during the war saved countless lives. Advances in aviation, electronics, and rocketry were staggering. The Manhattan Project, a secret government program to develop the atomic bomb, was the ultimate example of a large-scale, science-driven enterprise. The man who directed the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, Vannevar Bush, argued in his 1945 report, Science, the Endless Frontier, that the government should continue to fund scientific research in peacetime. This idea that science and technology were the keys to national progress and security became a central belief of the post-war era. This faith in technology fueled the optimism of the 1950s. The same scientific and industrial know-how that had won the war could now be turned to peaceful purposes. It could create new medicines, new consumer goods, and a higher standard of living for everyone. It could build highways, send rockets to the moon, and power cities with clean nuclear energy. This generation had a fundamentally optimistic view of technology. They had seen it work, they believed in progress, and they saw science and engineering as the engines of that progress. But there was a darker side to this technological inheritance. The war had demonstrated that new technologies could be used to kill and destroy on an unprecedented scale. The air raids that devastated cities in Europe and Japan showed the new vulnerability of civilian populations. And the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ushered in a new age of anxiety. For the first time, humanity possessed the technology to destroy itself. This new reality hung over the post-war world. The duck and cover, drills in schools, the fear of nuclear annihilation, the Cold War arms race, all of these were the direct legacy of the war's technological climax. So, the generation that won the war was left with a complex technological legacy. They were believers in progress, but they were also the first generation to live with the existential threat of nuclear war. They embraced the consumer technologies that made their lives easier, while also grappling with the fear of the superweapons their own ingenuity had created. Their relationship with technology was, therefore, both hopeful and fearful, a combination of the promise of a better future and the knowledge of a possible apocalypse. Did the experience of the Manhattan Project create a permanent, and perhaps dangerous, link between elite science and the military-industrial complex? How did the sudden leap in destructive capability from conventional bombs to atomic weapons change the fundamental psychology of the generation that lived through it? Did their faith in technological solutions to big problems make them less attuned to the social, ethical, and environmental consequences of that technology? Number 3 was Rosie the Riveter, a temporary hero or a permanent change. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the woman in the factory with her sleeve rolled up, is one of the most iconic of the home front. During the war, with millions of men in the military, the country faced a severe labor shortage. Women were called upon to fill the gap, and they responded in massive numbers. Over 6 million women entered the workforce during the war, many taking on jobs in heavy industry that had previously been considered men's work. They built planes, ships, and munitions. This experience was transformative both for the women themselves and for society's view of women's capabilities. But the question remains, was this a revolutionary moment or a temporary wartime necessity? The answer is complex. In the short term, much of the change was reversed. When the war ended, there was immense social and governmental pressure on women to leave their jobs and return to the home. The government and private companies that had run propaganda campaigns to lure women into the factories now ran campaigns encouraging them to embrace their roles as wives and mothers. The idea was to make room in the workforce for the returning veterans, and many women did leave their jobs, either voluntarily or because they were laid off. The post-war era saw a renewed emphasis on traditional gender roles and the ideal of the suburban homemaker. But the experience could not be erased. For the women who had worked in the war industries, something fundamental had changed. They had earned their own paychecks, learned new skills, and experienced a sense of independence and competence. A study by the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor found that a majority of women who had worked during the war wanted to keep working. The war had proven that women were capable of doing the same jobs as men. It shattered old stereotypes and gave millions of women a new sense of their own potential. This experience planted a seed that would blossom in the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s. The daughters of the Rosie, the Riveter generation grew up with mothers who had a different life experience than any generation of women before them. Even if their mothers had returned to the home, the memory and the story of their wartime work was part of the family history. The war created a new set of possibilities and expectations. It also highlighted the inequalities that still existed, and women were often paid less than men for the same work, and they had limited opportunities for advancement. The frustration with these inequalities, combined with the new sense of empowerment, helped to fuel the later push for women's rights. So, while Rosie may have been sent home after the war, her impact was permanent. The war was a catalyst that accelerated the entry of women into the paid labor force. It wasn't a straight line of progress, and the 1950s saw a temporary retreat into domesticity, but the door had been opened, and it would never be fully closed again. The war demonstrated on a national scale that a woman's place was wherever she wanted it to be. How did the experience of earning a man's wage and doing a man's job during the war affect the power dynamics within marriages after the men returned? Did the children of these working mothers, the baby boomers, absorb a different message about women's roles than the one presented in the mainstream culture of the 1950s? To what extent was the post-war celebration of the homemaker a direct and conscious reaction against the social disruption caused by women's wartime work? Number two, did a common enemy truly bring everyone together? The Second World War is often remembered as a time of unprecedented national unity. The attack on Pearl Harbor created a powerful sense of shared purpose. Political divisions were put aside, labor unions pledged not to strike. Everyone, it seemed, was focused on the single goal of winning the war. This sense of unity was real, and it was a major factor in the Allied victory. But it's also important to remember that this unity was not perfect. It was a complex and sometimes fragile thing, with deep social tensions still simmering beneath the surface. The most powerful force for unity was the existence of a clear external threat. The war provided a common enemy and a common cause. This was reinforced by a massive government propaganda effort. Posters, movies, and radio programs all promoted a message of patriotism and solidarity. Bond drives, scrap metal collections, and rationing were not just practical measures. They were rituals that allowed every citizen to participate in the war effort and feel like part of a national team. This shared experience, the sense that we're all in this together, created a powerful social cohesion that lasted for a generation. This unity was also reflected in the political sphere. The pre-war debates between isolationists and interventionists vanished overnight, and partisan politics became much less acrimonious. The generation that lived through this came to value consensus and nonpartisanship. They had seen what the country could achieve when it was united, and they often had little patience for the political squabbling of later eras. However, this picture of perfect unity is incomplete. As discussed earlier, the war did not erase racial divisions. In fact, the migration of African Americans to northern cities for work sometimes led to violent racial conflict. The internment of over 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, in camps by the U.S. government starting in 1942, is a stark reminder that the war also fueled racial prejudice and a suspension of civil liberties. This decision, authorized by President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, stands as one of the most significant violations of constitutional rights in American history. There were also labor disputes despite the no-strike pledges, as workers fought for fair wages in the face of wartime inflation. So the unity of the war years was real, but it was also a managed and curated unity. It was a unity focused on a specific external goal. It required the suppression of some internal conflicts and the exclusion of some groups from the full promise of American life. The generation that experienced it learned a powerful lesson about the strength of a united nation, but the experience also shows that national unity can be a complex and sometimes coercive force. It can bring people together, but it can also be used to silence dissent and ignore injustice. The unity of the Second World War was a powerful weapon, but like any weapon, it had to be handled with care. Did the intense pressure for national unity during the war create a lasting intolerance for social and political dissent in that generation? How did the government decide which internal divisions were acceptable to highlight, like class differences, which could be bridged by patriotism, and which were too dangerous to address, like racial inequality? Was the post-war social consensus less a product of genuine agreement and more a result of exhaustion from a decade and a half of crisis? Number one, how did making do with less become a way of life? The generation that fought the Second World War was uniquely shaped by two defining experiences: the Great Depression and the war itself. Both events taught them a powerful lesson in frugality and resourcefulness. The Depression had taught them about scarcity out of necessity, though the war taught them about scarcity as a patriotic duty. This combination created a deep-seated mindset of conservation, of use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. This was not just a passing habit, it was a core part of their character. The war effort required a massive mobilization of resources, and that meant a reduction in civilian consumption. The rationing system was the most visible sign of this. Every family had a ration book filled with stamps that limited their purchase of essential goods. This forced people to be creative. They learned to cook with less sugar and meat. They patched their clothes instead of buying new ones. They carpooled to save gasoline. This was not seen as a hardship to be resented, but as a contribution to be proud of. A popular slogan was, "Is this trip really necessary?" This question reflected a new way of thinking, a conscious evaluation of wants versus needs. This mindset extended beyond just rationing. The entire culture was geared toward conservation. People were encouraged to save everything. Tin cans, rubber tires, bacon grease, all were collected in national drives to be recycled into war materials. This was a generation that learned the true value of things. They understood that resources were finite and should not be wasted. This was a stark contrast to the throwaway consumer culture that would emerge in later decades. This experience of making do with less had a lasting impact on their post-war lives. Even when they became the most affluent generation in American history, many of them retained the frugal habits they had learned during the Depression and the war. They were often careful with their money, suspicious of debt, and resistant to waste. They were the original recyclers, saving bits of string and old containers, not because they were environmentalists, but because it was simply the sensible thing to do. You never knew when you might need it. This frugality was a source of great strength that gave them a sense of self-reliance and resilience. They knew how to survive on less. It also shaped their values. They tended to value experiences and relationships over material possessions. However, it could also create a gap in understanding with their children, the baby boomers, who grew up in a world of unprecedented abundance. The greatest generation's caution and thrift could sometimes seem like stinginess or a lack of imagination to their children, who had never known real scarcity. But for the generation that had lived through it, frugality was more than just a way to save money. It was a moral virtue, a testament to their ability to endure hardship, and a constant reminder of the sacrifices that had been required to build the world they lived in. Did this generation's deep-seated frugality inadvertently fuel the consumer boom of their children's generation as a form of rebellion against perceived deprivation? How did the experience of government-mandated scarcity through rationing shape their long-term views on the government's role in the economy? If a whole generation learns that personal consumption is secondary to the national good, what happens when the national good is no longer a clear and present danger, but the abstract goal of economic growth?